Hello. So I've had the Pat McGrath baby pink powder for about a month now, maybe just a little bit less than a month. And I wanted to come back and give an update because my last video was truly just first impressions, getting it out of the package and swatching it. And I think I put it on for like the first time. And I've been wearing this almost every day since, or at the very least comparing this with my other powders. And I wanted to come back and give an update because this is definitely not the powder that I thought I was going to be getting from Pat McGrath when I purchased a baby pink powder. Because as you can see here, and as pretty much every review that I have watched so far has said, this isn't very pink. And I think a lot of people were really disappointed by that, myself included. I wanted to come back and give you an idea of what this powder is, what I've found out about it, and my overall feelings towards it. And I think you'll be able to tell from this review that I still have some mixed feelings about this, but I want to be able to tell you why that is. So first and foremost, before I get to comparing this with any of my other powders, one thing that I have not heard in any other review about this so far, or in any of the marketing, is this is a new formula. And I don't know why this, like, no one said this, and no one, like, this doesn't seem to be anywhere. But this is a different formula than the other Pat McGrath under-eye blurring powders. And I kind of realized this sort of by accident, just by using this. Even the very first time, and I think I captured this in my other video, this powder just came out of the pan so much more easily than the other under-eye blurring powders that I've used. Just so much of this powder came off on my brush. And I didn't have to work for it at all. Like, I just tapped my brush in and a bunch of powder came off. And I kind of just chalked that up to this being a baked powder product. And a lot of times the first time you use a baked powder product, like the very top of the powder is, it's usually a little bit of a different texture than the rest of the powder underneath sort of that first crust layer. So I just assumed it was going to be a little bit different on top, and then as I got into the powder, it would just be exactly like the other under-eye blurring powders. And that has not been true at all. And so I just kept on using this for a while, and it just kept on being just a lot lighter, almost. Like, it came out of the pan a lot easier, but the application itself almost seemed lighter than my yellow powder. And you can even see here, like the yellow one I've had for a couple of years now, but you can see even like the wear pattern on these powders is different. Like, they just look different. And you can also see, and this is something that I kind of noticed after opening the pink powder, but it doesn't have these like little ridges. Like, you see how the yellow powder has this like stamp on top of it? Like the parts that I haven't touched yet, has this texture to it. And I think that was just part of the baking process. And I'm pretty sure all of the colors have that sort of stamped in the top. I assume as part of the manufacturing process. And this one did not have that. It has been smooth like this since I've taken it out of the package. And I wasn't quite sure when I realized it, so I went back and looked at my footage, and it looks like this right out of the package. It has this smooth top to it. And you can also see how it has this like gleam to it as well. And I mean, so does this. This has a gleam to the powder. Not where it's stamped, but there's more texture there. But the pink one seems to have more of a gleam to it. And that also transfers upon application. I noticed the pink powders having more of a sheen to it, more of a gleam to it than the yellow powder does. And the white powder, which I don't use. I gave mine away to one of my friends because it just shows up too chalky on my skin tone. But I thought this was really interesting. And the more that I compared these two, the more I thought this is just a very different powder overall, like not just a different color, but it feels different and it looks different, has a different finish, and it sits a little bit different on my skin. And luckily, I kept the wrapper for this. And I remember looking at the ingredients, and a couple of things stuck out to me immediately. One, the first thing that I saw was bismuth oxychloride. And I just know for a fact that this is not in the other powders. This is an ingredient that I'm very well aware of because I wear Bare Minerals. And the original Bare Minerals foundation gets that gleam that it has from this mineral, from this ingredient. And I would have noticed. It's just something that I would have paid attention to if I had seen this in the ingredient list of the other powders. And so I saw that and I was like, oh, that's strange. And then I looked further down and I saw carmine. And I guess that one's not super surprising because carmine's what's going to give the pink color in this powder. So that one's not surprising. And at first I was just kind of like, oh, well, you know, this just having bismuth oxychloride, this is probably just being used as more of a coloring agent. It doesn't really have a color to it, but it's going to give a finish. And it is a more brightening finish, which kind of makes sense with the way that this is being marketed as a brightening powder. And then I looked further up in the ingredients and I saw silk powder. And this is another thing that I would have noticed in the other powders because it's an ingredient I'm aware of, because if I remember correctly, I think it's in the Florasis powder. And it gives this powder a really nice, light, silky texture. It's just a nice thing to have in a powder. And I know I've had other powders with that ingredient in it as well, because I tend to like the feel of that. And so then I went and I found the ingredients for the original powders. I just went on to Sephora and the ingredients list looks totally different from this. I mean, the first few ingredients are similar, but then there's quite a few changes in here, starting with that silk powder. So then I went and found like actual packages or pictures of packages for all of the other colors to see, are they all the same? And is this one the only one that's different? And at first I thought that the light powder, the one that's very white in the pan, might be different, but it just doesn't have the iron oxides that the other one does since it's just white. But other than that, they're all the same formulation. The light, the yellow, the medium, and the deep color, those are all the same formulation. The only difference is that the light one doesn't have the iron oxides. And I think some of the ingredients are in a different order on the list, but it's otherwise the same formulation. This one, on the other hand, is different. This is missing some of the ingredients that the other ones have. And this has ingredients that the other ones don't have. But this is overall a different formula. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's very strange that that wasn't part of the marketing for this. I mean, I guess a lot of other people haven't noticed because I haven't heard anyone say this in their reviews, but I've noticed a significant difference in the formula between this and the yellow one that I have. Now, I guess maybe it's more obvious to me because I'm not comparing it with the white powder because that one doesn't work for me. And this one does. This one does work for me. So I think that unlike the white powder, I think that this one has less of a white base to it. I don't necessarily think it has a lot more color to it, like it doesn't have a lot of pink to it. But I do think that it has less whiteness to it. And then it also has the sheen to it. So it looks very different on my skin. Like if I had a way to explain it, I would say that the other colors they're not matte. There's a luminosity to them, but they are more matte than this pink powder. This pink powder has a true sheen to it that almost reminds me of, not a highlighter, but almost like an Hourglass powder. So this is Mood Light. And this is a powder that if you really build it up, it becomes almost a highlighter. You see how much more highlightery that is than either one of the finishing, or not the finishing, the setting powders. I don't know if you'll be able to see the difference, but maybe like right there in that angle. So this is the yellow powder, this is the pink powder, and then this is the Hourglass Mood Light powder. And to me, the yellow powder, it has a glow to it. It isn't matte, but it isn't nearly as luminous as the Pat McGrath pink powder. Now the pink powder, let me see if I can really build this up for you. I do feel like if you put a good bit of this on, I'm going to do the same thing with the yellow so you can see that it doesn't build up in the same way. You see how the pink one has more of a sheen to it? Like with that buildup, it looks closer to the Hourglass powder. And like the yellow one does have a glow to it as well. Like it's not matte, but it's different. It's not as smoothing. I mean, it is smoothing on the skin, but it doesn't smooth into that one sheen. And actually, the difference between Pat McGrath's pink powder and her yellow powder in terms of finish is kind of like the difference between Hourglass's Mood Light and Dim Light. You know how Dim Light gives you that very diffused look, whereas Hourglass's Mood Light gives you a lot more sheen, like what I'm showing here. That's kind of the difference between the finishes of these two Pat McGrath powders. And I keep on saying like, oh, the yellow one isn't matte, because I have to watch how I say it, because I have oily skin. My skin is, glowy. And so this is mattifying on my face. Like if I put this on my skin, it will mattify. It will look mattifying, either on my bare skin or on top of my Bare Minerals foundation. This looks mattifying. Whereas this one is not mattifying. It's slightly mattifying on top of my Bare Minerals original foundation, but if I put it on top of the Bare Minerals matte foundation, which I don't think is very matte personally, this looks very glowy. And because of it, it looks very natural on me. This mimics like a really beautiful glow on my skin. Like if my skin looked truly glowy instead of oily, this is what it would look like. It would look like the effect that this gives me on my skin. And it's really nice because it gives me almost the finishing effect of this Hourglass Mood Light powder, but it doesn't go to a highlight. Like I can go overboard with this Mood Light powder, whereas the Pat McGrath powder doesn't ever go overboard. You never get to that point where you look like a glazed donut. And I have totally done that before with this Mood Light powder and had to take it back off because it looked a little bit ridiculous. This just looks really nice on my skin. So I thought that was really interesting. And honestly, I've always thought about these Pat McGrath under eye blurring powders as almost like an Hourglass product. Like they remind me of these Hourglass baked powders, except they're able to set things. So this is Mood Light, and this is, I can never remember this, Ethereal Glow. This is actually a blush, but I use it as a finishing powder. And these all have a similar like texture to them. And I've always really appreciated that about these under eye blurring powders because they're kind of like these Hourglass finishing powders, except for they also set. So I've always really liked that. And I think this pink one is even more like Hourglass powders. It has that lightness to them. Like the other blurring powders can feel a little bit like they don't feel heavy on my skin, but like the actual powder can just feel a tiny bit more heavy. They just feel a little bit different, a little bit more different from the Hourglass powders. This one does not have this. If you put this in different packaging and told me this was an Hourglass powder, I wouldn't question it. I would question this one. I would not question this one at all. And I think that that's fantastic because I really love these kind of baked Hourglass powders. And I've always been sad that they've never made this kind of formulation in something that could set makeup. And I have tried using these to set makeup because I have heard of people doing that. These don't work for me. I just have super oily skin. Maybe someone with super dry skin can do that. I can't. But this powder does set my makeup really quite well. And it looks lovely. And it feels like these Hourglass powders. So in a way, I'm very impressed because this gives me a beautiful sheen that looks natural and beautiful on my skin. It's like one of those products that's like, you know, your skin but better. This really does give me that. It gives me a lot of what I love about Hourglass powders, but in a setting powder. And I think that's really neat. And I think it's unique, honestly. I can't think of another powder that I could compare this to in that way. There aren't that many powders that you can really compare with an Hourglass baked powder. It's part of the reason people love them so much, even though they kind of just keep on releasing the same things over and over, and there's a lot of gaps in their color range. Like these are the only two from Hourglass that I can use because I have very cool toned skin. And, you know, there's a whole issue around how deep these go, which is not very deep. But I think in the new formulation of this and the effect it gives on my skin, this has actually really impressed me a lot. And I wasn't really expecting that. I was expecting just to get this formulation, but in pink. And we'll get to the pinkness. But in terms of what this actually looks like on my skin and how it sets, it's fantastic. It gives me something that I didn't realize that I have wanted for a long time. But now let's bring this back to comparing it with the Westman Atelier powder. So the Westman Atelier powder is, before I purchased this pink powder from Pat McGrath, this is the powder that I was using every day. Like this was my daily powder to set my foundation or even just to put on my face. And I did like it. I didn't love it for a few reasons. One, it gives a little bit more of a matte finish than I personally love. I wouldn't call this mattifying, but again, because I have oily skin, it looks more matte on my skin and it just looks a little bit unnatural because of that. But I loved the color. I liked that it was very pink, although I wished it was more pink. But it also just kind of blends into my skin, which I really appreciate. So as much as I do wish it would give, you know, more pink, more color correction, I was fine with this. And you can't even see that. But I was fine with this. I think it was okay. I think I ended up giving it not a great review. Like the tone of my review is not overly praising of this product simply because it's very expensive. I don't feel like it lived up to its price point. Even though it is a good product, it's just overly expensive for what it is. And they still don't have refills. So it's just kind of like, why would you get this? But overall, I was okay with this product. And when I first got this Pat McGrath powder, I was very unhappy to see that the Westman Atelier powder had more of a pink color to it than the Pat McGrath powder. Because even though I was okay with how pink this was, I wished it had been more pink. And so when I saw this one, my immediate reaction was, oh, well, I'm not going to like it as much because it isn't going to be as pink. And even when you swatch these out, you can see a little bit, or at least I can see. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this in the camera. I'm like really trying to build this up for you so you can see what's going on. In the swatches, it's really hard to tell, but the Westman Atelier is a little bit more pink than the Pat McGrath. I really don't think that you're going to be able to tell in this lighting, in this camera, but in person, there's like a little bit. You can see that the Westman Atelier is a tiny bit more pink than the Pat McGrath, but they're still pretty, you know, they're both pink powders. They're both light pink powders. And so I kind of assumed that that would transfer to my face, that I would probably notice this one as being a little bit more color correcting than this one. And when I first used this, for the first few days that I used this, I was kind of, you know, internally lamenting, like, oh, it just doesn't have any color correction capacity. It's not doing anything. And then a few days I did these side by side. So setting one side of my face with one of these and then the other with the other one. And I kind of realized, as much as this looks more pink in the pan, they have the same effect on my face. I can't tell the difference between these two powders in terms of which one is color correcting more. They color correct the same on both sides of my face, both underneath my eyes and then on my cheeks for redness. I didn't really notice a huge difference. Now I can notice a huge difference in the finish of these. While this one looks decidedly more matte on my face, this one looks very luminous in a very natural, beautiful way on my skin. I do like this one a lot more because of that. So I appreciate that and I like that. And in wearing these side by side, I've kind of realized I do very much prefer the Pat McGrath powder. I also think that this one sets a lot better than the Westman Atelier. I think I had just gotten so used to the Westman Atelier that when I put this on and I did the side-by-side comparison, I was a little bit surprised to see it, you know, the end of the day or after, you know, 5 or 6 hours. The side with this one held up really well. There wasn't anything creasing or fading or doing anything weird. Like it looked basically the same as when I had set it originally. And even if my oils kind of came through, they just kind of meshed with the look of this powder and it looked really nice. Whereas the side with the Westman Atelier, it did crease a bit. And you could kind of tell when my oils came through because they'd come through in like different areas and different amounts and they kind of clashed with the matte look of this powder. So overall, even though in my original video I'm kind of disappointed with this powder, it has actually really outperformed the Westman Atelier for me by quite a lot. Now, some of this is just due to my own preferences. I'm not necessarily saying that this powder is overall better than the Westman Atelier. I think I would like more testing time to make that kind of a claim. But personally, I do prefer this Pat McGrath powder over the Westman Atelier. Now that's not super surprising because I've always preferred the Pat McGrath under eye blurring powder formula to like everything else I've ever tried. But I think this formula is actually a step up for me. So for me myself, I vastly prefer this powder to the Westman Atelier. Now, as for other comparisons, let me just go ahead and bring out all of my other powders, and there's a few that I want to compare this with that I don't think I did before. All right, so let me just go ahead and name all these different powders so that we can keep track of all of them. So Again, Westman Atelier, Pat McGrath, Baby Pink, Hourglass, Ethereal Glow. So this is a blush, but I use it as a finishing powder. This is Mood Light from Hourglass, Pat McGrath yellow powder, Florasis, the one that's green on one side and pink on the other. This is the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder, and this is the Huda Easy Bake powder in Cherry Blossom. So when I first got this, I kind of assumed it was going to be this formula, like the original under eye blurring powders. So I kind of compared these for the most part, I think. And then I compared just the color to the Huda Beauty, just because this is a pink setting powder. And I actually don't think of this powder, this Pat McGrath pink powder, as being all of that similar to the ones that I originally compared it with, as it is more luminous than the yellow powder. It's much more luminous than the Westman Atelier pink powder, and it is also more luminous than the Florasis powder. The Florasis powder gives a really nice soft matte finish, and I think of this as being either similar to the Pat McGrath yellow powder, just in terms of finish, like they both give like that sort of soft matte finish on my skin. And then the Westman Atelier is a bit more on the matte side. And this is very different from all three of these to me. I don't think of these as very good comparisons. So I'm going to go ahead and close these. So like I said earlier, I've been thinking of the Pat McGrath pink powder as being more similar to the finish of these two Hourglass powders, because it has this beautiful luminosity to it. And maybe for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hourglass powders, or if you are familiar with the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder, it actually has reminded me a little bit of this powder. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder because it's just, I don't know, it does something a little bit weird on my skin. It can get a little bit powdery on me. I don't find it to be very pink, and it also doesn't set very much on me. But it does have this beautiful glow to it. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see that. Let's put this right here. So this is one of those powders that I don't personally like, but I want to be able to give it its due, because I think, especially for an $8 powder, it's pretty fantastic. Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to tell on my skin, because my skin already has a fair amount of luminosity to it, but it has this really pretty glow to it. And sometimes it does go a little bit powdery on top of my Bare Minerals foundation. And Bare Minerals is pretty finicky, so I don't even know if it's the fault of this powder, but the reason that this powder has a cult following is, for a lot of people, it can set their makeup, but it also leaves a glow behind. Now, it doesn't work very well for me, but I have gotten it to work a few times. Not to set things properly, but to sit on top of my makeup, and it does have a beautiful sheen to it. And if I remember correctly, this also has that bismuth oxychloride in it, which I think is what gives it that beautiful sheen. And I think that this Pat McGrath powder is basically giving me what the e.l.f. Halo Glow gives to a lot of other people. Now, I'm not necessarily going to recommend getting the Pat McGrath powder if you already like the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder, because I mean, this is $35 and this is $8. You know, so if the e.l.f. Halo Glow works for you, that's fantastic. But I have a lot of issues with it. It doesn't work very consistently for me, and it never sets anything. So this is something that I will be giving away to one of my friends eventually. But if you like the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder, but you wish you had more from it, this might be the higher end version to look at. I think that these are actually very comparable. I do think of the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder as being more of a peachy pink, but I think that's just me. but there's a lot of similarities between these. I do find that the Pat McGrath powder is quite blurring. I've never really found the Ethereal Glow powder to be blurring, even though it's supposed to be. So if you have tried the Ethereal Glow powder and you were very meh about it, you're like, oh, I like this, but I wish it gave me more, I think that this powder from Pat McGrath is going to give you that beautiful sheen. It's going to set down your makeup better, and it's also going to give you blurring. So again, I don't want to tell you to get a 35 powder if you're happy with an $8 one, but if you wanted the, I guess, in my opinion, the better version of the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder, I would recommend the Pat McGrath. I think that this is really good. So in terms of finish, I do think that this Pat McGrath Under Eye Blurring powder reminds me more of these more luminous powders. It really has a beautiful luminosity to it that's very soft, but at least on my skin is very natural looking, and it just blends in with my skin just absolutely perfectly. Now, I did want to compare it with the Huda powder for a specific reason. Well, actually, two reasons. I did do some comparisons between these two in a similar way to how I compared the Pat McGrath powder to the Westman Atelier. And even though there is a distinct difference in how pink these are in the pan, I've also found that this color corrects just as well as the Huda one. I don't really know why that is, considering this one looks so much more pink in the compact than this one, but on my face they look the same amount of pink. And maybe what that actually means is none of these are doing any color correcting for me. That could totally be the answer. And maybe I just like pink powders a lot because they blend in with my skin tone really well. But I don't really see a difference in terms of like pinkness on my face. I don't see a difference in, how much darkness do these cover under my eyes. No, I don't see a difference in how much these blend in and mask redness at all. So yeah, I don't really notice a difference, even though there's a clear difference in how pink the Huda one is in comparison with the Pat McGrath. The other thing is I find that the blurring of the Pat McGrath pink powder is a little bit different from the blurring of the original yellow powder. This one, I've always thought of it blurring because there's more pigment to it. Like I can kind of see this powder on my face. Like if I lean close in, I can kind of see where this is on my face. And I just always assumed that that was part of how it was blurred on my skin, is you could just see the yellow, you could see the pigment, and it blurred in part by masking. And I was fine with that. I'm fine with how that looks. I don't find that this one does that at all. I don't find that this one has much coverage on my face. And actually the Westman Atelier, I think, has more coverage on my face. And so the Westman Atelier can sometimes do a little bit more for my under eye circles, just if I pack it on more. This one doesn't really ever do that. It never looks like powder on my face. And the way that it blurs is very different. And I'm comparing the blurring power of this powder to the Huda because the Huda does the same sort of thing. And I've never really been able to figure out what exactly the Huda powder is doing. This is part of the reason I haven't made a review for this powder yet. It's because I can't explain how this is blurring on my skin. I just noticed that when I put it on, if I do a light dusting on top of another powder and I look back in the mirror, my skin looks blurred. But it's not blurring by masking. It's not blurring by anything that I can detect. But these two blur in a similar fashion. And I wanted to say that because I've kind of kept this around, even though I find it a little bit too dehydrated on my skin, because I really like how it looks. And I really kind of like how that looked in comparison to the Westman Atelier, because the Westman Atelier tends to be a little bit more matte than I like. And this also this sets down makeup really, really well. Even better than the Pat McGrath powder. This just really sets your makeup in stone, and I like that. I just have to put it on top of another powder so that it doesn't directly dehydrate my skin. But I find that this gives me the same finish, and it doesn't irritate my skin in the same way that the Huda one does. Now, I'll probably still keep the Huda one because I just think it's fascinating. I think it's an interesting powder, and I do like that it can help set really emollient stuff on my face. That's something I've never been able to do with any other setting powder. So I'll probably still keep this around. But if you are someone who also enjoys how this blurs, but for whatever reason you don't enjoy other aspects of this powder, this Pat McGrath powder really does give you the blurring effect of this one, I think. And part of the reason I wanted to do this, or actually let me bring all these together again. So part of the reason I wanted to do this update was because even though I've only had this Pat McGrath powder for a month, and even though I'm still disappointed in it not being more pink than it is, I'm still really overall impressed by it. And if you haven't noticed, this kind of has replaced what I like about almost all of my other powders. It gives me a better finish than my Florasis powder. It gives me a better finish and a better color match for my skin tone than the Pat McGrath yellow under eye blurring powder. It gives me a better finish than the Westman Atelier, and it sets my makeup better than the Westman Atelier. It gives me something similar to what I get with the Huda powder, but the Huda powder I can't use directly on my skin, so I don't need a second powder to use the Pat McGrath. It's just simply a better version of the e.l.f. Halo Glow powder. And unlike the Hourglass powders that I love both of these, this can set my makeup and still give me a really nice finish that is similar-ish to these two. And I think that's really cool because if I really wanted to, this could be my one and only powder. And I think that's really neat. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and just get rid of all of my other powders. I enjoy having lots of powders. I enjoy having lots of different finishes and whatnot, but this is effectively a combination of all my favorites. And there's very little reason for me to reach for something else when I have this around. And so I wanted to come in here and say this and give this an updated review. I still don't think this is my final thoughts. I've only had this for a month. And I would really like to come back and see what I think about this in 6 months to a year. But for right now, I'm really impressed by it. I'm still disappointed that this isn't more pink. I'm still disappointed that it doesn't color correct the way that I wanted it to. But after having tested it out against my other pink powders, it does just as well. Or at the very least, the difference isn't detectable to me. And I love the finish, and I love how this sets, and I just love everything about this. So, kind of in conclusion, I'm disappointed with this powder, and I'm also incredibly impressed. I'm really happy I picked this up. Because honestly, if I had listened to all the other reviews that, oh, this is the same thing as the Pat McGrath white powder, I would have been missing out. I would have been missing out on what is easily my favorite powder and what can be my one and only powder. It's a powder that sets, that matches my skin tone really well, and that gives me a really nice finish that is on par with my Hourglass powders. And I think that's pretty amazing. So, if you made it to the end of this video, thank you. I don't know how you made it here, because I've been going on for a while now. I hope that this was enjoyable. I hope you got something out of this. If you have any questions on any of these powders, please let me know. I will eventually get around to reviewing all of these, even the ones I've had for like years at this point. But in the meantime, feel free to ask me anything. All right, well, I think this is it. But thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye for now.